Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. David, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. You study a lot and you teach a lot and you've been to a lot of conferences, which means you're good at public speaking. And that's what we need in people that are talking about the JFK subject because it seems like the public is not either hopping on board or they just don't have an interest. And we're trying to spark up that interest.
Well, it is what it is. It's been 61 years. I think the public will come along as much as we we project something that catches their attention, just like anything else. What catches the news cycle. I think the JFK assassination is rather unique in its ability to kind of recycle into the public consciousness so many times. And I think that's because even when it might seem to be in a dormant stage, like maybe like now, uh, as opposed to last November of the 60th anniversary, is that there's things that are still unresolved. And if you it, not to I'll flip to my sociology background. We talk about a negotiated order in sociology, and that implies that at some point, as a society, you kind of get to a place where most people have some consensus about. And yet there's sometimes where there's no things about that seem not to get to a consensus for a number of reasons, like abortion, for instance. That's a raging debate throughout our country that we've seemingly have never been able to, get to a point where we've settled in with that issue, or at least we maybe in recent times. Well, I'm abortion and the JFK are two totally different topics, and yet we're kind of the same thing with the JFK assassination. We've got this gap between our institution's willingness to kind of really take a serious look at this, which they really haven't, or they've been resistant towards that, and in the prevailing public opinion, despite being bombarded by a avalanche of lone nut mythology for 60 years, Americans still, by a majority, realize that there was probably a conspiracy in Dallas. They may not have the specific mm, knowledge about the who, what, and why, but they knew something was amiss in Dallas. There was something maybe sinister going on there that we haven't been told the truth. And so there's always that opportunity to come, I would say, to circle back to where it's in the public consciousness again. And that's what we just got to keep on doing it. And ultimately, as I always say, I mean, for democracy to survive, you need truth, you need justice, you need an openness that's on a level above. Maybe if you lived in an authoritarian regime or a dictatorship, truth wouldn't be important. It is really important here that and there's no statute of limitations on that justice. And 61 years down the road, we're still here seeking it. So that's kind of my answer about that.
Have you ever tried to think about why there is so much resistance in the Kennedy assassination, even in the discussions about it amongst either general population or just either lone nuts, researchers in general? It seems like everyone, especially an event like the six or just 60 years, 61 years since JFK was assassinated, that's a microscope on a very small event in the timeline of history, but it extends to so much where why we have all these independent theories, whether it's the Cubans, whether it's the CIA, whether it's whoever, take your pick. I'm wondering, have you ever thought about why that all these, I don't know, this spider web comes out? Because you can really take a who's who of the assassination and you would sit there for 60 years trying to figure out how is this person connected to this person who knew a cousin who met at a dinner and then at this part somehow knew Frank Sinatra.
Well, first of all, let's address the public and whether they might be interested or disinterested. I think that was in the first part of your question. And I think some of it lies in cynicism, that we general public has. I think if there are those that are resistant to it, they don't want to, the conspiracy, at least for a large segment of the population, is still something and I think the CIA in particular, very successful by the 1960s, labeling the notion of conspiracy, or if you will, conspiracy buffs, as almost a dirty word in a reference to a group of nuts who run around chasing baseless ideas and theories that are have no, as I said, basis in fact. When in reality, the if there are a lot of crazy conspiracy theories out there, there are on different varieties of subjects. The JFK assassination, or what happened with MLK and RFK, all three don't fit into that category. And the reasons being, there are facts of conspiracy, overwhelming facts of conspiracy, and your rational mind looks at the evidence, and you almost have to be irrational to go with anything lone nut, I would think. So there's that, and then the simple answer for why so many theories themselves have sprung up over the years associated with this case as well. You've got a vacuum with no legitimate investigation into the story. Uh, Folks have been free to run with any and every theory they like to regardless of its validity. So you've got a lot of people providing answers in a lot of different directions that have, the intelligence community, they talk about confidence level, you know, and there's a lot of different theories or different people that have made statements about the assassination. And I kind of, that's what I try to establish a level of confidence. What about this story? Like in Dallas, one of the big news stories that came out, so, but not a big story, it's kind of been recycled back, about Roscoe White and his son Ricky, who was in Dallas and spoke up for the first time in 30 years. He recovered a diary where his father apparently said he was one of the shooters on the knoll, and one of the individuals that uh, was involved in eliminating witnesses afterwards. And Roscoe White has there are some things there that his the fact that where he was at, where he was attached to the police force, that he was involved in the military prior to that. There's some things that add up on Roscoe White. Do we have 100% definitive answer and say, yep, that guy was on the knoll? I don't know if you can do that. I don't know. You just have to kind of have a level of what you think is trust in some of these things, and other things might, man, that doesn't add up. I mean, I have considerable doubts about this. It's very difficult at the end of the day, after 60 years, to absolutely prove or disprove anything. But you you have that level of confidence, and put it to the rational test, and maybe, just maybe, we can cut through all the subterfuge and fluff and stuff that has really no weight, or as I said, validity, and get to the facts that they as they stand.
Well, coming from your teaching perspective, when you're educating students on political assassinations through, United States history or just history in general, you look at and examine kind of the old stereotype, which is that like all the JFK people that are interested in it are mostly older folks. They're the older generations. They were around when it happened, or they were maybe a little way too young to really comprehend, but they kind of grew up in this culture of JFK. You have the younger generations that know a little bit about it, but they're also more open to learning and exploring those extra ideas. There is a period in the middle, probably around your age, maybe a little younger, that are not interested, or they don't necessarily believe conspiracy, or they don't want to talk about it. So there's the gap between the older generations that are dying off and then the younger generations that are coming in. Now, if you're focusing on, well, you kind of talk to both, but if you're talking to a younger generation, how do you explain to them the whole political assassinations, especially the 60s and 70s? I mean, the amount of lone nuts that pop out of that scenario is a little bit questionable just to hear about. When you hear about RFK, MLK, JFK, you're kind of like, why don't we hear about lone nuts now? We don't really have a whole lot of lone nuts now.
Well, uh, let's let's talk about the teaching thing, and the answer with students is just to arouse their curiosity. I mean, this story, meaning the, or as I the title of my class is Political Assassinations in the 1960s. And though there are some other things that one could look up at, we focus on JFK, MLK, and RFK, and those three incidents. But if you present the evidence, these all three of these stories just have like a natural curiosity, I think, that draws people in where you think, number one, something is amiss, something's wrong. Number two, uh, justice hasn't been done. And, I always like to quote from the movie JFK, for the X characters, where he says fundamentally people are suckers for the truth, which is a great line. It's a movie line, but it is nonetheless. And I think people are. I mean, if there's something that hasn't been brought to the surface, people want to know what it is. People want to. I think you mentioned different eras, but I think I don't want to get off too far into too many different things. But what's I know this the series, the octopus murders is really, which was kind of a very conspiratorial thing that was kind of reared itself in the 1990s and now it's kind of gotten back into the consciousness. It's I think a documentary series on one of the streaming networks that's really gained a lot of people's attention. And that's kind of the same thing. People, when they've been given some information that seems to be something amiss, something that doesn't seem right, some injustice done, folks want to know more about it, and some folks want to right that wrong, or at least bring to light what the truth is. We may not ever get our institutions to react the way we'd like to on all these things, but the highest level of truth resides in the mind, man. I mean, individual students, all of us, you, me, we can still, in our own minds, get to a level of understanding and say, you know what, that's what happened. Regardless whether you turn on the news and they say something else, maybe that's not the truth. And that's what we all want, the truth. And I think college students, you're right. It's not hard to, you have to lay out some evidence. You talked about the blow nut thing a little bit. And, first couple days, throw those things out and see how little sense the whole idea of a lone assassin actually made. It's not hard to pull those students in and say, look, let's look somewhere else. Let's try to find the truth about this.
And you can find the evidence when you're looking at government operations just in other countries, though, which people are more than happy to accept, but they couldn't think of it happening on United States soil, especially something as the Kennedy assassination, a president being killed in broad daylight. Can't be a conspiracy. It has to be a lone nut.
Yeah, and I think generationally, you're right. I mean, there's a group of people that have a hard time with that. I think the the college age generation is much more open or maybe cynical about those things. I don't think they've been, you kind of grow up with, like my father always said, he always, he'd tell me that, hey, Jerry Ford says it was Oswald did it. That's good enough for me. I mean, that he had that kind of, Jerry Ford's an honest man. Well, maybe he wasn't. And so I don't need to look at
No, he
anything
wasn't.
else. I don't need to look at anything else. I don't need to take any, uh, depth into and I think some people still do that. They kind of, you know, the resistance you get is like for those folks that A, don't want to be associated with anything involving conspiracy, and B, don't take the time to really look into the evidence. Or there's those people out there that, you know, like just with my classroom the other day, we were talking about the JFK in my history class at the end of the semester. And so I want to you subtle things like uh, I went on YouTube to pull up a uh, a film, a Zapruder film footage, which is like 8 million of them on Zapruder on the YouTube. You just pick out what you want, which ones. But the first one that pops up is somebody that's got a Zapruder film footage, in the headlines. Here it shows exactly how Oswald did it, and I'm thinking that's at the top of YouTube.
Of
I mean,
course.
how did that get there? And how the hell can you take the Zapruder film and prove Oswald did it, even in a state where most of us believe that the Zapruder film was doctored, and it was altered. Yet, even with alterations, it's just so, you know, beyond irrationality unless you want to twist everything around to some level of you know you you have to take such a leap of faith to look at the evidence and try to make the presumption that Oswald did it. There's so many things that you have to ignore. And like I tell my class, I said, yeah, maybe all those witnesses on Dealey Plaza didn't see what they saw. Or maybe that bullet could have done all that crazy stuff and like no other bullets done before. And yet, at the end of the day, you have to keep accepting these improbabilities on so many levels to stick to the Oswald alone thing. And I always tell my class, a series of improbabilities leads to impossibility. That you can't just keep doing that. You can't, maybe it's possible that 30, 40 witnesses did not see what they saw, but what's the likelihood? Okay. You know, maybe that bullet could come out clean with just a couple, whatever, millimeters missing, which nobody's ever seen before that shot a gun and hit anything. But is that probable? No, it's incredibly improbable. So after you get through these things, at some point you got to say, I can't do that anymore. I can't be that cynical. I've got to open my mind and say, something probably happened in Dallas, like what we have not been told. And that's the direction I think you need to go.
When you show your classes a Zapruder film, what do they say? I know you asked the question, or do you think which direction do you think the head goes?
Well, I think first of all is that there's usually a gasp, just like there has been for years, like from the time Geraldo Rivera showed the American public in 1976 for the first time on national TV on his whatever Tonight Show type thing, and the public was horrified. Then I think anybody that sees that for the first time, you see the brutal murder of the president in broad daylight. I mean, and I think, yeah, I think the logic is, you you still, whatever was done with the film, what could not be changed.
All right, you got to tell me about that. I don't know where you fall with it because every researcher is different with the Zapruder film.
Yeah,
I don't know when it got altered. I just noticed that it's very weird the chain of custody on that film.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, it is yeah. I mean, I'm not as a detailed expert on it as some who've studied it, like Doug Horn, who spoke at our thing in Kansas City. He was one with the Assassination Review Board.
Jacob
Uh,
Hornberger.
yeah, these guys really have dug into that deeply, but there's some simple things there. I mean, uh, one, physics. I mean, just like David Lifton 50 years ago when he wrote Best Evidence, got a chance to see the film and like, man, I'm a physicist. I can't understand how a head snap would go towards a shot. That's one thing. And then it's obvious that it's very consistent with the testimony of John Comley too. Uh, there's a let's see, what is the name? I can't recall on the film. Mark Lane did actually went and interviewed witnesses or we got film footage like in 1964 when everything was still fresh in people's minds. On that film he did, there's an interview of Conley right after he got out of the hospital in 1964. And Conley's just absolutely clear. Now he kind of did some backtracking over the years, but he's very clear in 1964. He said, "Man, I was not hit by the same bullet. I had to turn around and then I was hit." You watch the Zapruder film, it's the same obvious thing that John Con there was a gap there between when JFK is hit in the throat and John Connally has time. Just as he said, there's a a a time frame there between Kennedy being hit in the throat and John Connally being hit, and that again eliminates the single bullet theory. That one, if you don't have a single bullet, if you don't have one bullet causing all those wounds in Connally and Kennedy, then you've got a conspiracy. You have to hold this thing to three shots, which again is almost impossible. That even at Bethesda, there's evidence that they had enough bullet fragments that they took out of Kennedy's body, enough bullet fragments that were taken out of John Connally's wrist back in Dallas, that you've only got anything more than one bullet recovered. Put
I
it this
know.
way: anything more than one bullet recovered in either one of those medical procedures, the autopsy in Bethesda, Conley's surgery in Dallas, and you're over the limit, man. You got one because if Tate got hit by a bullet fragment in the base of the street, right? And then you got the recovery of CE 399, which is almost totally intact. If you find enough metal fragments beyond one bullet, which they had way over that. I mean,
I mean, how many
yes,
shots do you think were fired at JFK? Because, first of all, I just want to say, out of the Zapruder film, my always biggest claim is that we base a lot of like the number of shots on a silent film, which to me was like always ridiculous. I don't know how people try and they just skip over that. But if you really examine like from the bullets that you can see pictures of that were taken out of, whether it was above the rear view mirror in the limousine or the statements from cops saying that they were picking out bullet and brain matter and putting it into a bucket that was never submitted into evidence, or you have Buddy Walters that picked out a bullet out of the grass. If you think that was a bullet, there's a lot of bullets in Dealey Plaza where I try and wonder how many damn shots were fired. Like I can only see from Kennedy's reactions and Connolly's reactions, but there's no sound to that film. And then there's been speculated that Kennedy was caught in a crossfire. I think that's from statements from witnesses and police officers who have some military experience that did mention that. So it begs the question, I mean, how many shots do you think if you're going to estimate?
I I couldn't even begin to speculate the number of actual shots. I think what feel like there's strong evidence of is in terms of location. That obviously there's somebody from the grassy knoll shooting. I think from the angle of the shot, there was probably somebody shooting low flat behind from the Daltex building. And I think there's a growing amount of evidence to suggest that shots came from the general direction of the grassy knoll south too. There are pictures on the other side of the street. Been a lot of investigation that and it makes sense that you're gonna if you're gonna, I always back to the classroom thing. I always tell my class, I said, if you're gonna shoot the president, you better shoot the president. If you're just gonna look at this in a cold, calculated manner, you're not just gonna stick one guy out there like Lee Oswald with minimal shooting background or even one shooter. You better make sure you don't miss. And the way to do that is to have people shooting from multiple directions. And I think there's enough evidence of that. The actual number of shots, well, there's like you said, there's been a number of bullets recovered. Um, I just talked to he escapes my name, but about a year or two ago, I spoke with an ex FBI forensics expert whistleblower who said in the 1990s that there was a bullet recovered by cleanup duties people in Dealey Plaza out of the bushes that they determined had uh, the same unique paint that was used in those days on the presidential limo, and that the FBI probably had evidence of another shot then and covered it up. There've been discussions about bullets found on the rooftops in Dallas. I mean, Dennis David, who was a, a naval personnel at Bethesda, said a Secret Service agent or somebody with a classified clearance poured a flask of bullet fragments in front of him to have him sign off because David had a security clearance. He said there was more than one bullet and that the bullet fragments taken out of JFK's body. So you can just go on, and the it's almost ridiculous how you can easily show there were more than three shots in Dealey Plaza. And then you have to eliminate the possibility. And of course, then the whole thing came up with the Secret Service agent Paul Landis, and so finding a bullet in the back seat, maybe C399, that just brought a whole different thing into the conversation. But the point is, the impossibility of the single bullet theory. It just in 2024, I can say it's even more impossible if that's possible. I just made that up. But
Where do you think the evidence lies when it comes to the real conspiracy in the Kennedy case, besides trying to define the actual shooting, which I think is kind of a bit of a red herring? A lot of
yeah,
people have spent
I say
time
that too.
a lot of people have spent time trying to figure out where the shots came from or how many shots and all this, like we just kind of mentioned. But what about the real clear evidence that none of these were investigations, doing a proper investigation, thorough investigation when it came to the number of witnesses that should have been spoken to, or at least taken note of, testimony that was either put in or taken out of the Warren Commission documents, and then the limits of these investigations when it came to finding a conclusion based on the assumption that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. That is clear investigative fraud or just injustice of what their duties and responsibilities were to giving the American public the truth. And that came with every investigation, not just the Warren Commission.
Mhm. Well, I think it speaks to a high level of power. The fact that it was so difficult to even, you know, get close probably to what really happened and why it happened in Dallas. And you're right. I mean, th- we can spend all day talking about this or who was on what angle and all that. The point is, some folks were put out there by some powerful people. You don't. If this was a professional assassination or maybe military style assassination, the way it went down speaks to a high level of power. Then you have to look at who had that power, who had the power to make it happen, and obviously had the power to cover it up. And that those are the same old questions we've been asking a long time. And I think those are answerable questions. Again, it's like, but we have to talk about probabilities. And I know that, and and maybe those probabilities aren't definitive, but I know that sometimes being involved in history, sometimes you can't get to 100%. That doesn't mean well, you're just speculating. Well, sometimes you have to speculate. You can't just drop something and say, well, that's speculative, so I'm not even going to look at it. Well, maybe we still need to look at it. And and I think there's good evidence, strong evidence that you have to start in Texas itself. I mean, who controlled that scene? And the powerful Texans that were that that had control of that entire scene in Texas, who had an agenda, who
Like specifically LBJ, or are we talking about Harold Dryhole's Bird?
wanted to see Johnson be president. Johnson had an enormous uh, uh, motive, both to you know to It stands that who had Lyndon Johnson had the most to gain and the most to lose. I mean,
Yeah.
scandals were around him all over the place, and they all went away.
And if you know about the weird connections that he has politically, when we talk about Mac Wallace, I
Yeah,
think it was like
I mean, I'm not saying I just want to totally go down that road. I'm saying that's a part of the equation that you know, then that then there's this element of extreme anti-communism in America that was prevalent in across the lines in terms of in our military and our intelligence community, that had this fanatical viewpoint and frankly fanatical right-wing groups across America that could be that were willing to be engaged and saw Kennedy as a traitor. I mean, this kind of fanaticism wasn't just a group of folks, running around like the Proud Boys, storming the Capitol on January 6th. These were people that were in high places that had these extreme views in terms of wealth, money, oil, influence, the top of the intelligence community, at the top of the military. These people were serious people, and many of them hated Kennedy, saw him as a traitor, saw him as someone who was taking the country in a direction they did not want to go. That's a powerful amount of motivation. Now,
now, wait, hold on. If you think it's taken the country to a place where we don't want to go or where they don't want it to go, what about like someone like Alan Dulles, which would be the best example of that? But what about him just not wanting to lose his power? Because I mean, he was director for the longest time, and then he's sitting at a farm when Kennedy's killed. Then he's hired to investigate Kennedy's death. I mean, Alan Dulles doesn't necessarily strike me as someone that's a diehard patriot, even though it might come off that way. But it seems like he likes the power he has. It's like Hoover. He likes being involved in every single thing.
yeah, I would think that everybody may well have had a different motivation, but Dulles in the CIA up until the time of Kennedy as president had absolute power, and then they lost it. But again, you know, some of that is ideology in terms of the CIA's desire to wage the Cold War against Russia, Kennedy's desire to extricate ourselves from it. But you're right, Dulles. It might have been just a power move. I can't see how this thing happened without him. Let's point out that Dulles visited LBJ in Texas in September of 1963. Why? What the hell? Why does the ex, you know, head of the CIA need to visit the vice president 2 months prior to the assassination? Maybe it's all innocent. I don't know. But Dulles, Dulles is a player, man. I mean, evidence of that. I mean, we talked about some of the new documents. One of the things I ran across in early 1964 when one of the first books came out. It was a British book by Buchanan, I think. One of the first books suggesting conspiracy in the JFK assassination. I think, but in the early 1964, the CIA, had a real strong handle on suppressing anything other than Oswald acting alone. Well, this book comes out in England, and Richard Helms sends a classified, which always, I'm thinking, what? He sends a classified uh, memorandum to then private citizen who's been fired, Alan Dulles. He's got no official role. Pointing out to him this book's coming out claiming conspiracy. It's pretty odd, then ultimately, then Dulles is on the Warren Commission. It's pretty obvious that Helms, by early 64, recognizes that Dulles is the cover up guy. He's the guy. Here's the information. If somebody's suggesting conspiracy here, you better go do something about it, Alan Dulles. I think it speaks to Dulles's power before and after the assassination, in terms of he's definitely in control of the Warren Commission and the investigation and its conclusions. And yeah, he's a guy that cannot be ignored in his power position in terms of involving this.
Do you feel the same way about Gerald Ford? Because I think a lot of people connect the line that J. Edgar Hoover put Ford on that commission, so he had an FBI guy on the inside of what the commission's investigations were going to. Because you have to examine if Allen Dulles is head of the CIA, you got a
Yeah,
CIA
well,
guy on there.
I think Ford's a foot soldier. He's a guy that was, you know,
Clearly, the
who,
man can't even walk alone without falling.
yeah, I mean, he was. I don't think he had any. I don't think he had any prior knowledge of what happened in Dallas, but he was certainly Hoover's man on the Warren Commission, feeding information to him. You know, really trying to steer the public towards the lone nut theory. Though I think there were some cases where Ford may have admitted that there was something else, but he's just a guy that helped facilitate the lie. There's people. There are always people. There are people. There are patriots that that do what's right for the country in almost any situation. And then there are folks that'll just, like I said, follow along with the lies, facilitate them, you know, uh, allow the injustice to continue, and that's Gerald Ford. I mean, that's a category I would put him in, and he was in position to do it. But I think there's a nexus there between the intelligence community and some of the powerful people in Texas who want to see Lyndon Johnson be president in the oil people community. They had that right wing extremism and connections even into the military industrial complex in Texas that were apparent. These
I mean, it
people,
doesn't even show that he had any connection to doing it, but it does show some weird kind of personality traits when you look at Harold Dryhole's Bird putting the sixth floor window in his house and showing it off at parties as like this is the sniper's nest.
well, Bird is a connecting link. I always almost every presentation that I give, I almost invariably go to that thing about, well, if you really want to know what happened in Dallas, you start to ask who put Lee Oswald in that building if he was a patsy, and what are his connections? And the answer is D.H. Byrd, and his connections are incredible. I mean, he's he's obviously is a crony of Lyndon Johnson. He's good friends with Curtis LeMay, the biggest right wing fanatic in the Joint Chiefs. Uh, he apparently was at the time either in the process. I'm trying to get that down. I talked to my buddy Casey Quinlan about that too, but he was friends with and maybe hunting with Otto Skorzeny, the Nazi CIA
Oh yeah.
guy at the time of the assassination. He had connections
I
there.
think there's a photo of that with him and a mountain lion.
Yeah, he had connections with all the fanatical oil and the Dallas 8F, what is it, 8F Suite 8F group, and people had again interconnected in both oil and military industrial complex. D.H. Byrd was 1 degree of separation in terms of you look between the accused assassin and all these people that Byrd knew. Well, Byrd hired Oswald. You talk about 1 degree of separation between some of the most powerful people in America who had the biggest agenda against JFK and Lee Oswald, simply because Byrd's the guy that put him in that building. And you can't ignore that. You just can't. It's too much of a coincidence to say, oh, hey, wow, the guy that hired Oswald is connected to all these people. Oh, we'll just ignore that. If you want to, I guess you can. Or you might want to look into it and say there might be something sinister here. I mean, and that's part of the connecting links that you need to look at if you really want to know what happened in Dallas.
Well, how many cover-ups do you think were happening all at once? I mean, that's the real thing. I don't necessarily believe that the military-industrial complex was behind Jack Ruby, only to the extent towards making him forget or making him seem crazy in the end. But I would consider that's a Dallas police thing. I mean, they already had connections with Jack Ruby already. How do you get this strip club owner to shoot the killer of the president over patriotic indignation? Doesn't make really a whole lot of sense.
Well, to me, it tells you that, that the mob had a stake in this as well. The mob was connected again to some of the most powerful people in Dallas and connected to the intelligence community. I mean, obviously, Bobby Kennedy was trying to eliminate the mob. They had their share of motivation to these powerful people tended to connect and collude with each other, and there are connecting links. And with Jack Ruby, I think it does start with the mob. Before we came on, I mentioned to you some new stuff I had on Ruby, some intriguing things.
Where'd you find the new stuff?
Well, I just stumbled.
Okay.
It was brought to me. I mean, it's weird how, I actually live in central Illinois, and there's a town about 45 minutes northwest of me. It's really in the heart of America, very middle of America itself, Effingham, Illinois, which is about 3 hours south of Chicago, where I had some folks tell me, and usually when you got anecdotal stories like this, I mean, you have to take them seriously because they come from folks that really don't have any agenda, that don't really know anything about us other than what they know. And I was told that by a number of sources that after the assassination, that Jack Ruby, prior to the assassination, had spent some time working on oil wells uh, in a place called St. Elmo, which is a small town outside of Effingham, owned by H.L. Hunt. And of course, Hunt, there you go, one of the fanatics in Texas, and also maybe the most powerful man in the country in terms of his oil wealth. He had oil rigs all over the country. So yeah, he probably had some in Illinois. But Jack Ruby working in Illinois prior to the assassination at some point, well, why this came up is because uh, some people said that after the assassination, FBI agents showed up at this oil rig and told everybody to keep their damn mouths shut about the whole thing. That's where I kind of got my, really. Now, the thing that seems a little bit hard to digest is Jack Ruby working on oil wells. I mean, he ran nightclubs. You don't, he did a lot of stuff, but you don't see him kind of as some wildcat or a roughneck on an oil well. What's the connection, though? Well, we know Ruby and Hunt knew Ruby. They were somewhat close. H.L. Hunt.
Well, Ruby was in the
Supposedly
military
Ruby,
too.
supposedly Ruby visited H.L. Hunt's office that weekend, and then furthermore, what I found out is that Effingham, which again just north of me here, was a big mob hangout where Chicago mobsters. Ruby was a Chicago mobster. Came down. They have a nice lake there in Effingham. That it was kind of a getaway resort, small town getaway for mobsters coming down from Chicago. They own businesses down there. So then the fact that that Hunt still owns businesses in the Hunt property, still owns business in the Effingham area, and it starts some. You may wonder, maybe there is some truth to this. Maybe Ruby was doing something in Illinois for H.L. Hunt, and they somehow wanted to kind of prevent folks from you know trying to put two and two together with Jack Ruby. That's kind of some new things I found, and there's a lot there to Ruby. Of course, the document came out a few years ago. Maybe the most important document to come out of the new release was when the FBI informant suggested that the day of the assassination that Jack Ruby said, "I'm going to go down and watch the fireworks today on November 22nd." Well, I think everybody knows that it wasn't July 4th, that the fireworks meant that Ruby was telling somebody, "I'm going to go watch Kennedy get shot."
And fireworks aren't exactly good during the daytime either.
Yeah, and so uh, Ru- Ruby wasn't the only one that made that statement that day. He had a close ally named Gordon McClendon, which, by the way, there are 201 files I've seen on McClendon, meaning that he had a relationship or a connection with the CIA, or at least CIA interest. And McClendon was a true Texas insider connected to all, like much like D.H. Byrd in a different way. McClendon was interconnected. He was a radio personality with so many folks in Texas that are important in this story, and eventually the CIA. You mentioned David Atlee Phillips. Well, I mean, David Atlee Phillips in the 1970s uh, joined with Gordon McClendon to form the retired CIA agents, and their agenda was to shut down the House Select Committee's investigation of the assassination. So McClendon has ties everywhere. Well, he's also close to Ruby, and apparently there are witnesses that suggested that that McClendon basically said the same thing that morning in his office that Ruby did. Something to the fact, I'm going to see the president get shot today. So when Ruby's arrested later on that weekend, the first thing that comes out of his mouth, he calls out for Gordon McClendon. So you start to make all these, Ruby connections start going in a lot of different directions. There's no question about it. And one more piece of the puzzle, I think, about what and why happened. I think Ruby was a fallback. I think it's pretty clear that the conspirators most likely wanted to get Oswald eliminated or out of the country, and when that didn't happen, they had to go to a plan B, and Jack Ruby was the plan B. And walk in there and shoot Oswald and make sure he never talks again. And that's part of the equation as well.
Have you learned more or been more confused as the years have gone on with the number of documents that get released and the number, I guess, of researchers that you come in contact with and conferences you've spoken at? I find myself feeling like I understand a bit, but then I also feel a bit lost in some certain areas. But there's a lot in the assassination because it's been examined so much that you can honestly just come across a new document, and next thing you know, everything you thought you knew, you didn't know.
Yeah, or a new theory, a new individuals uncover new information, or
Still
someone
only
has
heard
come
the Israel thing once. That's the only time I've ever heard the Israel thing.
out there. I mean, uh, so which over the years, yeah, you get overwhelmed with these things. You kind of think you've got an idea about what happened in Dallas, and then uh, a new part of the equation becomes a new element, a new piece of evidence, a new accusation, and you can't you just can't run from one theory to the next. You can't just say, okay, I forget, I'm going to go with this, or I'm going to go with that. What you have to do is just try to kind of digest everything, and also realize that, again, I get back to what I began with about level of competence. To borrow something from the intelligence community, do you have a high level of competence or do you not? Uh, I usually go on the idea of assume nothing, dismiss nothing, totally 100%. But you go forward and you say, well, that might be another element to this that might fit in, that might fit into the puzzle. Or maybe this person has some information that's correct, maybe some of it's not. But you just try to kind of digest it, assimilate it into some coherent, rational explanation about what happened in Dallas. But you're right; it has an incredible amount of complication. There's so many people associated with this story. It's incredible that are been witnesses or maybe have some connected in some way. It just seemingly has no end to it. And that's maybe in part because it's been out there for 60 years and nothing, there's been no official investigation, but my goodness, the amount of researchers that have dug into this and uncovered this, uncovered that. I mean, so how do you sift through all that and come to some conclusion? Well, that's again, your rational mind's got to do the work and decide for yourself what you want to really accept here.
How amongst your other academics, friends, anyone that you know from the academic community, do you find resistance with them? Because I can give you the example what I usually get from academics is why does it matter? Why does the Kennedy stuff matter? Why does any of looking into operations or any of this type of stuff matter? And to me, it's always just been interesting, but I think it gives you a better depiction of what people will go to and what extent they'll go to, even people that we are supposed to consider law.
You know, if I'll say that no, I'm not exposed to a lot of. I mean, my associates here at the community college level, or we have. I'm really we're a smaller campus. I'm basically the only real history guy on campus, so there's not someone really for me to sit down and debate with. I mean, I think the people on my campus have always been open to what I've done and my investigations. But yeah, I hear what you say. It's almost like a level of arrogance that some people might have on the academic, like, but the why does it matter thing? I mean, somebody really needs to be called out. I mean, I would if somebody on the level of history came to me and said it's not really that important what happened in Dallas anymore. It's 60 years ago, and I would say, you call yourself a historian, and you're telling me that something as pivotal as the JFK assassination doesn't really matter anymore in the course that we took. And that to me would be a staggering amount of of insensitivity on the part of any historian if they suggested that to me. That would be, you don't think it's important, and you call yourself an historian. I mean, 61 years is not in terms of studying history is not a long period of time. That's still fresh. There are still people alive that are associated with this thing and and you can see the direct impact. It's incredibly important in 2024 what happened in Dallas and what direction we were taken because of it. I don't know how you can not even if you choose to cling to the lone assassin theory. I don't see how you could, de-emphasize the importance of what happened in Dallas. Does that make sense
It
from an
does.
historical standpoint?
I
Yeah,
mean, from their standpoint, they would probably shout out something like, "What about Gaza?" or "What about something like that?" That would completely. They're more focused into more common current events. I've had a few academics from the skeptics community, the ones, the debunkers, and they're like, "Why does it matter?" And I'm like, "Well, it matters for a whole host of reasons. I consider the heart attack on the CIA show and the church committee good." Historical things that should be taught only because it shows a precedent of dirty actions. Now, for me, I examine the military industrial complex through the Kennedy assassination. But when historians look at the Kennedy assassination, it gets so lumped in with conspiracy that they don't want to touch it. But I've also noticed it's leaked into other events. Northwoods, when the documents came out in 2022, people are calling that a conspiracy. And plenty of things like MK Ultra, they have no knowledge on. And I was like, wait, what? I was like, you don't know about MK Ultra? And they're like, I know about the Tuskegee experiments. I'm like, well, everybody knows about that. But again, not an isolated incident. There's been other things that leak out when you don't correct some of this corruption,
that's
which is the whole
exactly.
point in learning it.
The whole point is that because we didn't get to the truth in Dallas, I think it's, the folks, I'm not saying the same exact group of folks were associated with the other assassinations later on in the 60s, but it became apparent that assassination could be an effective tool for those who wanted to change the course of America's, uh, whether foreign policy, domestic policy, or even democratic system. That that assassination became a tool. The elimination of of significant leaders like RFK and MLK, and it could be done. It would happen in Dallas. It could be done again. I would say if I mean, ask yourself. I've never really delved in this to just in degree, but this is a great critical thinking question is, do you really think that RFK and MLK would have been assassinated if we had successfully prosecuted the perpetrators in Dallas? Do you think those other two things would have happened? Hell no, they wouldn't have. I mean, the because there wouldn't be in a path that you run the risk of being caught, but they weren't caught in Dallas, so those things continue to happen.
Have you noticed media talking about it more? I've noticed when I turn on the TV, there's a lot of stuff about JFK. Now it is kind of Fox News. It's just whatever plays at the gym when I'm there. And CNN doesn't talk about it a whole lot, but I've noticed at least some media sites now at least talking more about the Kennedy assassination, even when it's not an anniversary, which is to me just kind of surprising.
Well, I think we have succeeded, and I keep talking about the last years about moving the needle. That there's been enough suspicious things that have came out that the media has been forced to look at, that I think the narrative has changed about what happened. The narrative is one thing you do not hear as much anymore as it used to. That media types would always look at talk about conspiracies, and then the JFK assassination would be the prime example of another baseless conspiracy theory, or making some analogy about, yeah, okay, so and so was on the grassy knoll, or some derisive comment attaching the JFK assassination to baseless conspiracies, like we talked about being. They're not doing that now. They're not. They are not. The media is taking seriously the idea of something conspiratorial happened in Dallas. They can no longer just pass it off as another fantasy, some wild conspiracy theory. There's been too much that's been there, too much, the resistance to release documents has caught the attention of the American public and the media. The Landis story. There's just been a number of things that have come out that have gotten to the point where they have to take this in a more serious fashion, and that's good. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to get to the bottom of the truth about what happened. I mean, some folks are doing damage control a little bit, I think, too. Like, I always make the example of Gerald Posner, who's a favorite to put on there. Posner, the guy, the lone nut, the case closed guy, who's always been the expert on the intelligence community and the defender of Oswald did it. Even he's come on TV and recently, and now he's speaking in terms of how, because the CIA was withholding documents, that now he wants to be the point of criticism is now that the CIA did have knowledge of Oswald and didn't do anything about it. He's kind of modified his position. It's still, that's not, it's, that
He's been
that's,
confronted with the CIA withholding information and he's denied
yeah,
it. So that's his fault. That's him.
it's limited. It's what the CIA refers to as a limited hangout. Like, yeah, the CIA was at fault here because they had information on Oswald, but they didn't do anything. No, that's not the truth. But it's a kind of a convenient little repositioning that Poser and others have taken. But to me, that's like, it's moving the needle. The idea of just totally dismissing anything conspiratorial in Dallas has become a much more difficult position to stick to these days. That would be my answer. Because of what has trickled out in the last few years, I think, or over 60 years.
Does it give you a little bit more faith about it being solved in our lifetime?
Maybe. I mean,
I'm a bit more optimistic.
yeah, ultimately, you know, ultimately, I think the only do I think the government of the United States will ultimately make an announcement and say, look, we screwed up about what happened in Dallas. There was a conspiracy. We're now admitting it, kind of like what happened, in 1988 when the government of the United States admitted the mistake they made in removing uh, Japanese Americans from their homes and during World War II. At Executive Order 9066 was wrong, was immoral, was an incorrect act, and we're apologizing for it. We're paying reparations. No, we're not going to get that. We're not going to get that ever. I don't think. What you might ultimately get to, though, is a kind of a different explanation at the media level and hopefully at the academic level. There's going to one day somebody's going to wake up and pick up a history book and it's going to, you know, take the correct position that something sinister happened in Dallas that can't be ignored. That, because of the weight of the evidence, I think is a possibility. Getting some official recognition from the government that a wrong has been done, probably not.
I'll
Governments,
try and remain a little bit
especially
optimistic now.
I mean, they will be on some things that are, that are maybe not as, I don't want to diminish them, but the
Ranges of severity.
yeah. Removing Japanese Americans from their homes in World War II was an injustice, and yet it doesn't rise to the level of taking out a president.
Yeah.
That was a policy mistake. That wasn't a gross, a
Targeted
criminal
assassination.
ordering of assassination of the head of the United States. So the gravity of that might prevent the government from ever taking that position officially, but yet I think we can eventually modify what's defined in our country as what is the truth. It may not be in our lifetimes, but I think it might ultimately happen.
Well, David, I appreciate the time, and always I appreciate our chats that we have. But is there a place where people can find any of your links and where people can look you up and be able to see some of your work?
Oh, definitely. JFK Historical Group, real easy to put in. We've got some put some several of the articles I've written, latest articles about classified documents, and a lot of film footage of some excellent speakers at some of our events. We do have a big event coming up in Dallas again in November. Uh, we meet there each anniversary, and we have some excellent speakers lined up, like Doug Horn, Ed Tatro, David Manick, and David Knight, Brian Edwards, just some of the people that are going to be there in Dallas. And so we encourage folks to be part of that either in person or on Zoom. You can find out about that conference happening on the November 21st through 24. That's there as well. JFK Historical Group. Please encourage folks to take a look. And Robbie, thanks again for having me on. Appreciate it.
I'll make sure I link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you again. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.